The great coffee shop you're at.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Heather Berg.
and Prof. Berg. Lovely to meet you, albeit virtually. And you've got one of those obscured backgrounds, but it looks like a
Yeah.
loft,
Yes.
which is interesting because I'm in a coffee shop called The Loft. So
Ah, it looks lovely. It's a good
it
good
is
garden.
one of Guadalajara's
Mm,
wonders.
so
Really
beautiful.
amazing. It is beautiful,
Yeah.
Prof. The only thing about the beauty is that the wet season began yesterday, and that
Mm,
means dengue-bearing mosquitoes are bearing down on me.
ah,
So you'll find me occasionally looking suspiciously around me.
yes. Yes. You've got your cedar oil or something like this.
I've got all my supposedly
Okay.
effective alternative repellents,
Great.
all over me. So, Prof, much as I want this to be all about me, we're really here
Mhm.
to chat about you and in particular your work. Now, I want to start with my cliche query that I pose to everybody, which is to ask what's currently impeding, dynamizing, interesting, preoccupying you. What's going on for the prof?
Mm. Well, by way of disclosure or explanation, I'll say one thing that's impeding me is that I have a cold from my Germany child. So sorry to the listeners, but thanks for you for bearing with me on that. But I suppose as a broader answer to that question, I'm just really kind of fixated on this question of what it looks like to find ease and joy in the day to day while living under fascism and climate destruction and continued genocide that my tax dollars are funding. I mean, it's just a kind of constant project um, to think about what it looks like to live in this world in the kind of most abundant ways possible while holding on to all of that. So I would say that feels yes like a preoccupation.
And you're not supposed to believe in or say such things or write such things either,
No,
of course.
no. But I suppose uh, we could be there's some freedom in knowing that we could all be axed for doing much less. So it gives me a sort of a sense that we may as well tell the truth, right?
And in who knows how long, you may have a far right, maniacal, bald English governor. And
Right.
being bald is not very relevant, but I'm just throwing everything at him I can.
Yeah.
He really is bad news. But I
Yeah.
guess my big thing at the moment is actually Gavin Newsom and Pete Hegseth's hair product.
Mm,
What are they using? And has anybody alerted them to how bad it looks? How they just seem like they're guys from the 30s? And are they actually
mm.
the same person? Have they ever been
Ooh,
together in the same room? Look at that hairdo.
yes,
What's
yes.
your take?
I'm a bad one for this because I sort of limit myself to written and and like audio, radio news. And so I I've sort of excused myself from the visual circus of it all. So I will look this up when we're done with our call.
When you get the chance, because there's a pomade going on that both these dudes have and that I find profoundly disturbing. However,
Yes.
let's talk about your work. And I wondered if we could start with the very broad question of the labor struggles and situations of so-called independent contractors in the United
Mm,
States. And you've written about this at philosophical and legal levels, but also
yeah.
experiential ones. So can you give
Mhm.
us the juice on what an independent contractor is and the advantages, so-called, and
Mhm.
disadvantages of that status?
Sure, yeah. Well, the short version is that US labor law sets up this totally artificial binary between an employee and an independent contractor that has its roots in racist and sexist origins of labor law protections themselves, where where policymakers were intent on figuring out a way to make sure that migrant farm workers and domestic laborers, often migrant and Black women, were not covered under basic labor protections. And they did this by carving out an exception to things like wage and hour law, occupational health policy, various um, subsequent interventions such as coverage under anti-discrimination law. All of these things come to be attached to employment status. And those outside of employment status, the independent contractor is the legal category, are denied formal access to them. So I think, one thing that I try to make clear in conversations around this is that contrary to, various ideas about the rise of the gig economy, particularly in a digital context, independent contractor status isn't new. It is old. Its origins are in these, very calcified, racialized and gendered divisions of labor, and they do, have just a tremendous impact on how working people experience their lives and the law. The thing that is new is that the sort of deprivations of independent contractor status are getting democratized, if you will, or widened out. So more and more jobs are looking like those contingent jobs. And that in the US context, that includes things like nursing, for example, various forms of office work, just things that historically have been protected from that division, except in the case of temp work, which is a related labor problem. And and yes, this just shapes working people's lives in all sorts of ways. So that's the kind of broad strokes, and then the kind of intervention that I'm trying to make around this through the labor analysis of foreign workers and other sex workers, is to push against the primary left labor line around independent contractor status in the United States, which is the idea that what we should be fighting for is to gain employment status for people who have been misclassified as independent contractors, and that is a key problem. And also, what I've learned from foreign workers and other sex workers is that misclassification isn't really the point. The point is the initial and absolutely fabricated binary in the first place. So many of them advocate, rather than focusing on these, kind of specific legal fights to shift one's classification or to force an employer to recognize one's rightful classification as an employee. What we should be doing is ditching the whole binary in the first
Pitching the
place.
category. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that was interesting in Spain during COVID was that whereas in other countries, people like Uber drivers did not get governmental support with the drop in use of their services because they were deemed independent contractors in many countries. But in Spain, 4 companies subcontracted to Uber. And so their employees were deemed independent contractors by Uber, but not by them. They were employees. And this meant when government money became available to support workers for whom there was no opportunity, they could get it. It shows some of the flexibility as well as the corruption of an entity like Uber.
Absolutely.
But onto this issue of organizing, 30 years ago, I knew some people in the Bay Area of California, specifically San Francisco, who were involved in a sex workers union. I forget what it was called. Maybe it was called that, Union of Sex Workers. And were trying hard to get recognition, to get adherence, to make progress. But I'm out of touch with all of that now. And I wondered if you could let us know where that sort of movement seems to be, since you mentioned having chatted with folks involved in it as part of your
Mhm.
research?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure which specific campaign you're talking about, but there have been and continue to be various successful sex worker unions in the United States. Those, by the nature of the law, have to exist in decriminalized or legal sex work industries. So a criminalized industry doesn't have the formal right to unionize. Erotic dancers or strippers, as well as in some cases, porn performers have, excuse me, um, have undertaken these campaigns, particularly in the case of dancers with a lot of success. And one of the things that organizers struggle over is exactly this question of how much they should be focusing on independent contractor status as their fight. So many of the most successful campaigns have taken the approach of focusing on independent contractor misclassification, whereas others are are less convinced, I would say, that gaining employee classification is going to address their primary concerns. And what I'll say, just for a little bit more background for listeners who aren't familiar on the issue of misclassification, is that the law has very particular parameters for what constitutes an independent contractor versus an employee. But like most labor law, employers flout these all of the time. And so this is another problem with a straightforward legal reform approach, is that the law says one thing and bosses break it. And so this is just another reason that some worker organizers aren't convinced that that's kind of where their energy should be. But on the level, I guess to do a short version of the kind of legal nerding out we would need to do to really parse the misclassification piece. Basically, in order to be legally an independent contractor, one would have to be doing work that is fairly autonomous. If your employer tells you when to work and how, and if your work is an integral part of the business, then you're an employee according to the law. But of course, that's not what it looks like on the ground. Uber, for example, that you've mentioned, maintains that, as you say, that their drivers are independent contractors. And obviously, this isn't the case because their work is integral to the business. It is the business, and the algorithm has a tremendous amount of power to determine when and how people work. But Uber's argument is that because they're not telling people when their shift is, that they are not operating as an employee. So that's just one example. Another is, in terms of my research, that um, many porn directors proudly told me that they break the law by classifying people as independent contractors. Meanwhile, the express purpose of a director in this case is to tell people when to show up for work, what the scene might look like. And obviously, porn performance is not just integral, but the entire condition of possibility for a porn production company.
There's
So
nothing without it. And just to explain to
no.
folks listening, one reason why, and there are all these different terms, but exotic dancing, erotic dancing, stripping is legal in the US is because of the First Amendment to the Constitution. It's deemed to be free expression. But if you're a municipal government in a small town, you can insist that the places where this occurs be absolutely on the outskirts in the interest of public order, which means that the employees in these bars are next to extremely rough districts with all kinds of complex policing or survival questions. Yeah. You're muted, Prof.
Sorry, I was just having a cough, so I
Yeah.
muted myself for that. But yes, yeah, that's exactly what I mean. These contestations over naming are all contestations over how one the extent to which one is exposed to state surveillance, to stigma, and all of this.
All the rest of it. Now, onto the porn work. You've engaged in not only the production of a book about this, and also done a lot of editing and writing, also some round tables and some op-eds. So you're out there in talking about this, not just at a scholarly level. But I wanted to hone in on that for a moment, because a theme that you look at in some of your work is the fact that for some people in the industry, and historically, a lot of this is in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, for those interested in the US industry for all sorts of reasons, including all the graduates from UCLA who can't get jobs in Hollywood and so become directors in the Valley. Shh, don't tell anybody I said so.
Yeah.
But one of the issues you raise is that some of the people involved in industry are not that keen on all these PhDs and books that are appearing about sex work, porn work, and so on. I wondered if you could talk a bit about that, because there has been a slew of ethnographies, I would say over 20 years now, produced by scholarship, as scholarship, by folks who've been participant observers in the industry, who may have paid their undergrad and grad debts by embarking on it. So could you chat a little bit about that and the reasons why it's controversial?
Yeah, I mean, I think I will say I'm not sure what interview you're speaking to, but for the most part, I would say that folks in the porn industry um, have been quite happy for the attention. I think in part because it's quite a public facing industry, and a lot of people have the sense that like any publicity is good publicity. That came up a lot. Um, but there's a lot of bad journalism and academic work on sex work, including porn, and yeah, porn performers are quite critical of some of the tendencies of that work. And this is something that I think is not unique to sex work, but just the extractiveness of ethnographic research is I think an ethical problem, but particularly one when you're thinking about a stigmatized community. But I think beyond that, the question of stigma and how such work might direct surveillance to particular workers, or community organizers is really this sense of extraction. And sex workers are very kind of self-aware of the relations of extraction generally, and so they think about like what it means that academics and journalists are making money off of their words, just like directors are making money off of their performances. So that's something that I think folks have a pretty keen analysis of. Um, and to the point of sex worker academics, um, I think there's a lot of community support for folks within the industry who go on to do academic work, and there's a sense that people who have work experience in the industry will have, of course, a kind of deeper view of it. But it can also be tricky to mark out boundaries there when folks are part of a community and also writing its story. So I've definitely seen some sense of that there's an invasiveness there when people have gathered information through one capacity and then convey it in another.
And there are some powerful strands of feminism, both historically and in the current moment, very opposed to this expression, sex work even. One of those people is Cather Pollitt, who's a prominent public intellectual in the United States, poet, essayist for The Nation. The Nation is an allegedly left but really liberal weekly in the magazine, and magazine in the US. And you've gone into bat against her perspective. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that, and more generally, some of these struggles within feminism about the status, the definition, the rights, the aspirations of sex workers.
Yeah, I mean, my sort of bitchiest answer to that is that bourgeois women will do a lot to make themselves feel good about hiring maids. And I do think that that is a lot of what's going on with with anti-sex worker feminism. There's what the main contestation is that these thinkers say again and again that people like me and like sex worker organizers are legitimizing sex work by calling it work when they see it as something that is exploitative, violent, objectifying. And what I think is just so intellectually dishonest about that is that they refuse again and again to acknowledge that all of us are saying that work as such, work under racial capitalism, is illegitimate. So to call sex work work is not to legitimize it. It's to say it's part of this system, this disgusting system in which all of us, uh, journalists for the nation, professors, and also escorts have to do things for money that we wouldn't otherwise do, because we live in a system that forces us to work to live. And what I have said, again and again, and what sex worker organizers say is that calling it work in that context is merely to highlight our interconnectedness in these shared struggles against capitalism. That's the point of naming it as work. But from a bourgeois feminist perspective, where other work is fine, particularly, say, the work that you benefit from when someone cleans your house or uh, does your editing for you or stocks grocery shelves or whatever, that work has to be fine. This is why I believe this is why they hold on to the idea that work is a good thing. And then they have this reactive response to calling sex work work because they've convinced themselves that work is okay, but it's not, and there's no cleaning that up. Work under this system is exploitative at base, and what sex workers say is that again, like using this language helps highlight that. But I'm just fascinated by um, how committed it's like very smart people who I do think have reading comprehension are uh, to pretending that that's not being, exactly what we're saying. Instead, they focus on these kind of fringe examples of a handful of libertarian clients, often who say in a free market, people should be able to sell what they want. And that's just not a position that most sex workers take. And so there, I just think it's fascinating that people who call themselves feminists are just obsessed with what a few men say, and continue to misrepresent, I should say, what sex working women say about their own experience of labor under capitalism.
In one of your opinion pieces, or whatever we call these things, essays, you talk about sex workers as being in the vanguard of labor. And just a quick note here for listeners outside the US, 50 years ago, a high percentage of US employees were unionized. Now
Yeah.
it's a very low percentage, mostly government workers. And interestingly, in the entertainment sector, there's pretty high unionization in Hollywood and in big time sports. So this is the aristocracy of labor. And they're strong on unionism and have been for a long time. There are particular reasons for that. But they're there and they stand up for it. Tell us about sex workers being in a vanguard for labor.
Well, I think the first thing I want to clarify is that when I say labor there, I don't just mean trade unionism. And that's exactly why I think sex workers are at the vanguard, because they understand, and I'll quote one sex worker thinker here, Vanessa Carlisle, who's the founder of Hookers Army Los Angeles, who talks about unionizing as harm reduction, which I think is just such a useful framework. So it's not an anti-union perspective, but it's to say trade union organizing is just one piece of a broader suite of anti-capitalist technologies that we might bring to bear on class struggle. And what makes sex workers at the vanguard of struggles for working class justice is that they understand that they understand that trade union demands um, are just kind of one step of a much longer political project, that we can't stop at better hours, we can't stop at fairer wages, slightly better benefits, and part of what makes that possible is that sex workers have really expansive demands that can't be fully addressed through trade union politics. And one of those is that because there's such a high representation in sex worker communities of people with disabilities, there's a real disability lens here that makes clear that just 8 hours for what we will is the traditional um, uh, claim is just not enough. And that's where we get this movement of sex workers against work, of anti-work sex workers. And there's just not a lot of room for anti-work critique in trade union movements. And that's where I think sex workers' perspectives are just so vital. The other thing is that sex workers know that the state is the primary class antagonist. And that is something that I think many unionists have forgotten. It's something that union movements knew at their inception, but labor's own Red Scare, the purging of anti-state anarchist and communist militants, has left us with institutions like the AFL-CIO, which compared to these early movements are quite tame in their tactics and in their demands. But those approaches to working class struggle just don't satisfy sex workers, and that's why I think sex workers are at the vanguard.
The AFL-CIO, folks, is the peak
Oh,
organization that speaks
yes,
supposedly for the union movement in the United States. It's a merger of what was always pretty much a company union model with what was a radical union model,
right,
resulting in the defanging of one by the other.
yeah,
So what is it? American Federation of Labor, Council of Industrial Organizations, but probably no one in the world,
that's right.
except the kind of nerds you invoked earlier, know what the abbreviation stands for. Now, Prof,
But all of your listeners, like wherever they may be situated, um, have local trade union movements that mimic these tendencies. Just as one example, I'll say there's a newish book, a collection of writing from Gabriella Light, that is grandmother daughter. I'm forgetting the order, but grandmother, mother, daughter, whore. She's a well-known Brazilian sex worker activist, and she has a parallel critique of local trade unions where she said like they all wanted us to be sex professionals, but we were whores. And it is that refusal of professionalization that I think is um, so politically rich.
yes, this is daughter, mother, grandmother, and
Thank you.
whore. The story of
That
a
makes
woman
sense
who
in that
decided
order.
to be a puta.
Right.
Uh, Now, speaking of books, Prof, here in the Global South, we have limited access to scholarly work, especially books that are published in English. So whilst I've read a lot of your work, which is generously available online, I have to confess I've not read your first book, Porn Work. So although you've probably touched on some elements of that, I wonder if there are things you'd like to add to talk about the issue of precarity as experienced by porn workers.
Yeah, I mean, on the precarity piece, I would say that the book is interested in this dialectic where, and this is something many workers in all sorts of industries can identify with, that people come to industries like porn in search of autonomy, in search of a reprieve from the tedium and the violence of straight jobs, of non-sex work jobs. They want more money in fewer hours. They want work that is less controlled in the kinds of day-to-day ways that many straight jobs are. Um, and they come to independently contracted, gigified, creative work like porn in search of just a little bit more room to maneuver. Um, and because of the way the law is set up, and because of the way that stigma operates, they find new forms of precarity on the other side. And so, what I'm trying to do with that book is to talk about that dynamic as, again, a construction of these systems that set up the binaries in the first place and that dangle respectability for people who are willing to clock in to 9 to 5 or low wage service work jobs, and be compliant within them. I mean, so I in my forthcoming book, I talk about respectability as this kind of David Roediger talks about the psychic wages of whiteness. So this idea that working class whiteness, like whiteness itself, isn't actually that much of a material benefit. Obviously, it helps people move in the world and avoid some kinds of violence, but um, but the psychic wages of whiteness. The point is that whiteness is really this sort of uh, concession that the racial capitalist system throws to working class white people to get them to stay in line. And I think about respectability in line with that too. That respectability doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't make your body any less destroyed by work. None of those things. It doesn't bring joy, but people cling to it because it's sold to them as something that you may be clocking in for your shitty grocery store job, but at least you're not a whore. And I do think that is offered up to people as a kind of supplementary payment. And so that's something that porn workers talk about a lot, that they give up respectability, but um, they gain forms of autonomy that are meaningful to them.
And speaking of that book, I note that it's forthcoming in the fall of this year. Notes
Yeah,
from the Sex Worker Left, Lumpen Theory. What's lumpen theory, Prof? Give us the scoop.
sure. Um, so there, I'm playing with Marx's original idea of the lumpen proletariat, which he understood to be the disrespectable, often criminalized. He thought to be impossible to organize without access to class consciousness, counterpart to the respectable proletariat, the respectable working class. And so this was people like prostitutes, like the unhoused, like disabled people who couldn't work, like drug dealers, etc. So that the kind of who exactly counts rag pickers, in Marx's um, original conception. So who counts as part of the lumpen shifts over time. But Marx himself thought that these people, because they weren't in centralized workplaces producing things, couldn't access class consciousness and thus would be ill-suited to be revolutionary agents, and could in some ways be conscripted to the other side as mercenaries, and that was his concern. But then you have various radical thinkers in the 20th century who kind of turned this on its head. Everyone ranging from Frantz Fanon to Chairman Mao to the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords. And their thinking is that the lumpen, because they're outside of working class respectability, have in fact a better view of the system. And as Pablo Guzman, the Young Lords thinker, said, the lumpen has nothing to lose. And so that is what makes them more powerful, more potent revolutionary agents. So I work from that understanding. And I'm thinking about sex workers as one such example of the lumpen, whose, again, estrangement from the norms of respectable work, of respectable citizenship, and of respectable family life positions them to have just an incredibly clear-eyed and incisive view of the workings of power, and also a really expansive understanding of what we have to demand instead.
Class issues bring me on to an essay of yours that is giving an intellectual history and really a prehistory of the Me Too movement.
Mm.
And I wondered if you could share with us a wee bit of your stance on Me Too.
But yeah, I suppose this goes back to your earlier question about anti-sex worker feminists, and particularly in the you mentioned Katha Pollitt, um, but that essay on Me Too is concerned with a kind of parallel tendency on the part of bourgeois, often white, but not always white, feminists, um, to fixate on the kind of figure, the limit case of the prostitute as uh, as the specter that sort of haunts me too. And they say this, and they actually say this out loud, that the problem with I'm thinking about you know hugely influential feminist theorists such as Catherine McKinnon, who say that the problem with sexual harassment in the mainstream workplace is that it treats women workers like whores, which I think is just such a an incredibly violent way to put this. To think that the reason that harassment is a problem is basically what they're saying is that it treats, say, the actress who's having to deal with Harvey Weinstein or the office worker who's being sexually harassed, that it treats her like a whore. And that kind of work of analogy uh, does a few things. One, it is sort of necessarily racist and classist. It's trading in like all of these anxieties that people bring um, to the idea of service and subservience. It also pushes sex workers out of the community of women who might benefit from a movement such as Me Too. Um, but I think the most insidious thing is that it imagines that we could have a harassment-free workplace under gendered racial capitalism. And what sex workers make clear again and again is that that's just not possible. That when you have to work in order to pay for your basic living necessities, you will be put necessarily by the system more than by any individual asshole boss um, in a position of having to say yes to things that don't feel good to you. So it is gendered racial capitalism that sets up the conditions for sexual harassment to flourish. And I'm arguing in that essay that in part because of its snobbishness around sex work, which is necessarily again a racist and classist project, that the movement can't even begin to ask those questions. And I think that that's telling that we had the, and I think there were a lot of things about the Me Too movement that I'm really appreciative of, but the fact that it didn't open up a broader conversation around the commodification of daily life is just wild to me. It just really refused to engage bigger questions of economic power. Um, and I think that the reason for that is because many of the bourgeois women at the helm of the movement and academically theorizing it have a lot personally at stake in being in a dominant position in race and class hierarchies. And it really just wouldn't serve them to be asking those bigger questions. Because again, what these women want is for sex work not to exist, but for maids to show up readily at their homes. And you just can't get that if you're willing to ask those bigger questions.
I'm smiling because I lived for many years in LA. And after a few years, I decided that I would get around without a car. So I gave my car away and I took
Yeah.
mass transit everywhere. And so frequently, I would be the only white guy, apart from a homeless person, on mass transit, particularly the sort of orange and brown buses across LA.
Yeah.
And if I was going around the privileged West Side in particular, where nice liberal white people vote Democrat, the other people on the bus, especially if it was early in the morning, would almost exclusively be Latina maids who would get off in these areas with nicely clipped lawns to go and keep these places clean and nice for their employers, where there were no sidewalks. There was absolutely
Yeah.
no possibility
Right.
of making your way around in any ordinary
Yeah.
fashion. So yes, a small anecdote. Prof, I have one last query for you. And once you've answered
Okay.
it, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you might wish. That might take the form of going over terrain we've already crossed, we've already traversed, or it might be a new theme. Does that sound okay as a means of concluding things?
It does, yeah.
Thank you for carrying on, through the cough. You've been wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for your patience with me and to listeners too. I would say, I apologize, but I also I would tell my own students and comrades not to apologize for the casualties of being a caretaker. This is how we live in the world. So, yeah.
Of course. But apologizing is part of being a British imperialist. One learns to apologize even
Sure.
for things one didn't do. If somebody bumps into you and punches you, you say,
Mm.
I'm sorry, is your fist okay? And this is the white
Oh,
man's
really?
burden of imperialism. Yes.
Oh,
Very important,
interesting.
apologizing. Anyway, my
Mm,
last
yeah.
question is about religion,
Okay.
because you've also written about the antithetical nature of religion for you, qua woman. I wondered if you could
Mm.
elaborate on that a little bit. Why religion
I know
is not
that I
for me as a woman.
Oh God, did you go through the internet to like a thing I wrote as an undergraduate for uh that this was I think 20 years ago. Um for a very small grant while I was I think a freshman in college. That's the only thing that fits this bill that I can think
Look,
of.
it could well be.
Yes,
Yes.
that's oh boy. Um
If you don't
well,
want to, if you don't want to elaborate on something that I've read much more recently than you have, we can forget
yeah.
about it. That's fine.
Oh gosh, I mean, no, 20 years ago I was just a baby and I was trying to get my tuition covered and I was not eligible for you know many things and there was this one little grant from I think some kind of atheist organization and so I wrote an essay and that must be what you found. But that is ancient history.
Freedom from Religion Foundation.
Yes, indeed. Yes, this is so long ago. Gosh, I don't know what else you might have found from when I was 17, but I shudder to think.
No, that's all.
Okay,
That's all. The rest is, I think, from when you were a grad student and a professor. So let's leave that to one
sure.
side. But it has an interesting argument because it says living beyond religion does not mean living in a moral vacuum. That's
Ah,
the point of the thing. So
okay.
to conclude matters, is there anything you'd like to add? As I said, that might be something entirely new that we haven't discussed, or it might be something where we've said some things, but you want to say a little
Mhm.
more.
Yeah, I mean, I've just finished teaching my class on sex and money, which is um, engaged entirely with sex worker writing, and I so what's on my mind, I left that class to come to you, and so my students were talking about a takeaway for them, and so that's top of mind for me. So I guess I might recirculate that here, and that is that they were really moved by the idea that sex workers' analyses of life under gendered racial capitalism don't just illuminate sex work, but they illuminate all of our maneuverings under this system. And so they had all sorts of great ideas about what it might look like to take sex workers um, analytical gifts and apply them to the realms of paid work and unpaid sexuality outside out in the world. So I suppose that might be something I'll leave with is what it might look like to perform the kind of sharp self-reflexiveness that sex workers demonstrate about the relationships of exploitation in daily life, thinking about in listeners' own jobs, what you're showing up for that you wouldn't if you didn't have bills to pay. And I'm thinking about that both again in terms of waged work and unpaid sexual life, um, and what kinds of engagements with labor and relationality might be possible under a system where we didn't have bills to pay. So I think that might be my invitation as we close.
Well, many thanks, Prof. Heather Berg. I've really enjoyed chatting with you today. I've learned a great deal thanks to our conversation, as I have from your work.
Thanks for having me.